Thank you so much and welcome everyone. Like we were saying earlier today before everyone joined on, I feel like every single day is a week, every week is a month, and every month is a year. I'm in San Francisco, so now I am in day 22 of my shelter in place, and I'm sure that a lot of you in New York are in similar situations. So before we start, I just wanted to acknowledge that we're all in these extraordinary circumstances. There's so much pressure and there's so much stress and anxiety on each one of us to make the right decisions about our school, to make the right decisions about our family. So Ari and I are here today to offer you some tools and some guidance on how to approach the financial decisions that you're making through the concept of data modeling. And so what we're going to do is, before I turn things over to Ari, I see that a couple people have added their names and their schools in the chat. Since we can't see all your beautiful faces because we're looking at the screen, if you could just go into the chat and tell us who's here, that would be incredibly helpful for us just to know who's in the room. The other thing that I wanted to do is I just wanted to give you a step-by-step introduction of what we're going to be doing today. First, Ari is going to kick us off with just a little bit of context to the crisis. Then we're going to look at a decision-making framework, which is mission-driven, community-centered, and data-informed decision-making. Then we're going to jump into the meat of the presentation, which is showing you a data model that we've created to project out what are the implications of COVID on both the FY19-20 school year and then also FY20 and 21. Throughout, we're going to have some periods where we'll take a pause and get questions from you, but there will be some time at the end as well. Just like Marcy said, this model is not necessarily specifically targeted to finance or CFO people. It's really looking at how to convey pretty complex financial decisions to a non-financial audience. So we're thinking of your heads of school, we're thinking of your boards. So really look at the model as an approximation of what's going on in your school, because we know every single school has different methodologies, different ways of accounting. And so this is just one way. And I'm working with a school, we're having an emergency board meeting tonight. And so we went in and changed all the formulas to fit that school. So really this would be a customized model to how you do accounting and then how you approach different questions. So thank you, I'm seeing a whole bunch of names. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ari to get us started.
Good morning, everybody. I wish we were talking under better circumstances. I'm Ari Betof. I'm the president of Organizational Sustainability Consulting. But on a more personal note, I want to say my sister and her husband live in New York City. She is a melanoma attending at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and actually this week pivoted over to one of their ICUs to be a doctor in one of their ICUs this week. And so between that and I'm now in New York every other weekend when we are not social distancing, finishing an executive MBA at Cornell on the Roosevelt Island campus. I have tremendous deep feelings for what you all are going through, particularly in New York State and New York City, and know that we are all thinking about you. And many of us are eager to help you in all the ways that we can in this really difficult time. So with that said, let me turn our attention to the topic of the day, which is the financial challenges we face as an independent school community. And in many ways, some of you may be familiar with this idea of a black swan event. So Investotopia defines a black swan event as an unpredictable event that is beyond what is normally expected of a situation and has potentially severe consequences. That black swan events are characterized by extreme rarity, severe impact, and widespread insistence that they were obvious in hindsight. And we could have a long conversation about whether COVID-19 is a black swan event following on the heels of Ebola crises and H1N1 and SARS. But I think when you look back at past black swan events, the Great Recession, the dot-com boom, we can see some parallels that we can draw from that, and we'll weave some of those through our conversation today. Similarly, I want to just use as a framing what happened in the Fukushima tsunami disaster. So that was a multi-stage disaster, similar to the challenges we're seeing today. Very different context, locally, obviously isolated to one area in one country, but this idea of an earthquake followed immediately by a tsunami, followed by a nuclear meltdown, has, I think, some important lessons for us as we think at a much more global scale about pandemic followed by economic challenges and the kind of disruption that we have seen. Many of you at this point may have already seen this article that came out from Inside Higher Education on March 27th. Inside Higher Education did a survey of 164 university and college presidents. And I think not surprisingly, their top concern was mental health of students and employees. And I think those of us who have been heads of school know that pastoral care role that we feel about taking care of our communities. But right behind that was short-term unbudgeted financial costs as a concern and accelerated rates of student attrition. So short-term financial challenges and longer-term financial implications. Physical health of employees and students followed immediately by accessibility to online learning platforms, readiness to conduct online learning, which is, I know, the swamp that you all have been trying to navigate for the last number of weeks. And I do feel like in some ways, this is one of the first weeks where heads of schools and CFOs have sort of been able to begin to lift their heads up from the things directly in front of them and think a little bit further out. I know some of you have already been doing that work, but so many school communities have been inundated with just the transition to remote learning and with need to care for the members of the community, that this is really the first chance to look a little bit more broadly. So I started a lot of this work in 2005 when I began my doctoral studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And I actually began a dissertation, or I thought I was beginning a dissertation, around the idea of stewardship of independent schools. And as the economy began to fall apart and as we headed into the Great Recession, I pivoted my research focus to be around financial and organizational sustainability of independent schools during the Great Recession. And that's been a focus of mine really for a long time. I built what was really in many ways a first generation of the kind of sensitivity modeling that you'll see today and that we'll show you in and around that time in about 2006. As you will see, Kelsey's skills around modeling and data visualization are far, far superior to mine, but it's been wonderful for us. We'll talk a little bit about the work that we've done in a number of settings together over the last several years. But this idea of stress testing and sensitivity analysis are things that we are becoming more familiar about. And there are both lessons that we can learn from 2008, and I think ways in which this challenge at its scale are also really quite different. And we'll discuss those as well. One of the things that I want to mention is about the role of communication. And this is primarily today a financial discussion, but we know that as school leaders, the financial numbers are just one piece of what it takes to make good decisions. Communication is utterly critical, and so we wanted to address this up front. Deborah Wilson, who's the former chief legal officer for NAIS, now the president of the Southern Association of Independent Schools, said this wonderful thing to Kelsey and me. She said, for heads of school are sort of choosing their own adventures, but at least they need to know what the hazards of those choices are. And those happen in several different areas. So timing of decision-making, the goodwill or bad will caused by those decisions, especially around things like refunds and emergency financial aid. So some schools, for example, decided to do some refunds very early, and they, I think in a lot of cases, have regretted those decisions because as they decided to refund for this or this, the goodwill that they were hoping to create has actually turned into bad will among parents who feel like their particular needs were not being met. Similarly, timing is really important, and we're going to talk a little bit about timing of things like when to make decisions about summer camp. I'm working with a camp in Pennsylvania, and they've made the decision that they've communicated really well about the fact they're going to make a decision about each weekly session as late as they can in an effort to try to be able to serve families this year. But I think the fact that they have communicated that early and well with families and their employees has really helped them hold that community together at a distance. Similarly with reductions in force, and we'll talk a little bit about the CARES Act today as well. schools, and we know this from 2008, will likely come out of this really challenging period either in an upward spiral where they will be hurt, but that they will leave it stronger and the ability to get stronger and stronger and stronger each year, or they will leave it in a downward spiral. And that whether or not they're ultimately able to navigate this period, that the actions that they take and the way they frame them will either really strengthen or weaken the school. Finally, I want to touch base about this idea about seduction of false optimism. And we have a number of people on the webinar who I know personally, and they've probably heard me use these words before. We all want to be optimistic about our schools, but there's a difference between being optimistic and being seduced by pure false optimism. I promise you that the CARES Act will not save your school long-term, right? It may float you for a few months. It may help you survive the day or the month or the week, but that is not going to solve the ills that for some schools, they have come out of the last 10 years of of arguably the strongest economic period in our country's history on very much thin ice. And that's despite tremendous work by you as a head of school and a CFO and the board and the faculty. Schools need to be very honest with where they fall in a particular spectrum that we're going to talk a lot about today. The spectrum between needing to focus on financial viability, stability, or sustainability. And the reality is you cannot focus on medium-term stability coming out of the pandemic in a solid or as solid as possible position, or long-term financial sustainability if you're not open, right? And that's the viability question. And so the way that schools will frame the questions that we're talking about today are particularly in that model. If you are a school that is particularly concerned about getting through the next 4 weeks or 3 or 6 or 12 months, that is a different set of key questions, most key questions, than the schools that know that they'll be able to survive the next year or two and need to think about how to move through that period best. And we'll try to talk to that range today. I'm going to turn it back over to Kelsey, who's going to speak a little bit more to the framework of decision-making that we're using for today's conversation.
Fantastic, thanks. So Ari and I first bonded over our shared hatred of the term data-driven decision-making. Because to me, this concept of data-driven decision-making is very ruthless. It's almost Machiavellian, and it does not jive with what I know to be that empathetic, warm community of independent schools and independent school leaders. And so Ari has always used, and Ari, I'm just going to remind you to mute. And so Ari first used can you go back? Perfect. Mission-driven, data-informed. And so when I was at NAS, you're skipping all over the place. There we go. When I was at NAS, I was fortunate enough to be on the Jobs to Be Done research team. And so after spending 1 year really deep diving into what it means to interview people and to understand what are those underlying motivations but underneath what they're telling you, I have added a third lens to this decision-making framework. So it's mission-driven, community-centered, and data-informed. So I would say that most schools have the mission-driven part really strong and really at the forefront of their decision-making. And a lot of schools keep their finger on the pulse of their community through surveys, through conversations. But then that data-informed piece, sometimes schools have that and sometimes schools really don't. Schools are swimming in data, but a lot of times they're lacking either the skill set or the time or the technology wherewithal to really pull insights from that data. And so we're going to introduce data modeling as a way to get at that data-informed decision-making piece. So we're going to walk through this decision-making framework with one question that a lot of our friends in independent schools are asking themselves right now, and that's the question of, should we furlough workers? So we're thinking about it from the FY19 point of view, either after-school care workers, bus drivers, any of your non-exempt employees even, people who are not actively interfacing with students now. So that question is, can we cut expenses by furloughing those workers? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to turn to that chat, and then we're going to walk through this decision-making framework, these 3 decision points of mission-driven, community-centered, and data-informed decision-making. So if you were looking at this question of should we furlough our workers in this FY19, FY20, and a Q4 period, and you ask yourself, does that decision of furloughing workers align with the mission and values of the school? Would you say, and Ari can skip to the next one really quickly. Would you say yes or no? And so if you pull up that chat box really quickly, just go ahead and add your answer. Does furloughing workers align with the mission and values of the school? No, 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 no. No, 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 no. No. A resounding no so far. So then you have to look at that same question through the next lens of our decision-making framework. Does this action match the underlying anxieties and drivers of our communities? So I want you to go through a hypothetical thought experiment. If you're going to interview or have a conversation with those workers that you would be furloughing, what do you think would be the concerns that they're bringing up? Are they scared for their emotional well-being, their financial well-being, their family? What are those underlying anxieties? What are those drivers of their behavior of wanting to be furloughed or wanting to not be furloughed be if you sat them down and had a conversation? So again, go to the chat and think about if you had a conversation with those people that you were considering to be furloughed. What are the underlying anxieties or fears or worries that you thought you would hear from a conversation with those people? So go ahead and add those to the chat. And then Ari, if you could just go to a yes or no. Personal financial security, financial and emotional concerns. What happens when unemployment runs out? Finances, providing for their family. I can't support my family. Being able to afford food and rent, family support, money, healthcare, all of those concerns. So when you're thinking, oh, this is a great one. What does this say about my value in the school community? I absolutely love that one, Brandy. Wanting to stay at this job, not wanting a different job. So there's all of these concerns and fears that this question of furloughing workers would bring up. So then you have to think, would this align with being community-centered? Would furloughing workers align with being community-centered at your school? Yes or no? Let's see what you say. No, 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 no. So if we stopped here and if we just looked at this problem through a mission-driven lens and a community-centered lens, what I would venture to say is that every single one of you would say a strong, strong no to this question of furloughing workers. However, this is where that data-informed piece comes in. If we were going to model out what the possible outcomes of furloughing workers would be. So let's say we kept every single worker up. Ari, you can go to the next slide. Perfect. Thank you. So we kept every single one of those workers on force and we paid them throughout the entire crisis, no matter what happens, and we made that commitment. And we ran that simulation, we ran that model 100 times. And 99 out of those 100 times, that decision to keep every single one of those workers resulted in our school being in financial peril. I would then say to you that you should absolutely furlough those workers, because the data tells you that that decision is that keeping every single worker would be unwise to your school. So even though it's aligned with the mission, it's aligned with what the community wants to keep everyone on, we then have to filter it through that hard lens of data to see if it's actually possible. So go to the next slide.
Can I just say, Kelsey, as we're transitioning, some of you may have seen Guilford College. I'm an alumnus actually in North Carolina, just furloughed about 150 of their staff and faculty. Quaker school, I think many of us have a sense of what the values of a Quaker school are. And they did that because that is the only way that they believe that they can navigate this period financially and keep the college open. I know the president really well. We served on a board together, and I know that was a painful decision for her, but she is trying to act as a steward of that institution that she has been entrusted with. That was an incredibly painful decision. But I think it was made the right way, and I think it was probably the right decision. Given all the factors and trying to do the best she could as the president of that college.
So there's a couple of questions in the chat that I do want to address before we move on. What if you don't understand what the degree of financial impact would be? You are absolutely
You're in the right place.
setting me up
That's right.
perfectly. So the idea of data modeling is how you would understand what the impact of that financial decision would be. And Ari, I'm going to remind you to mute as well. So when I said run it 100 times, I was actually not kidding on that. The concept of having a data model is running it many, many, many times and really understanding what are the possibilities that could come out of the model. And so I'm going to direct your attention to that curve, because when you're running a data model, what you're actually doing is you're creating a probability curve. So you're going to have some runs of that model where it's the worst case scenario. You're losing 40 students. The market is still tanking. We are closed until, oh my gosh, I don't even want to say it, but to December. And so you're going to get some outcomes out of that model that are way to the far side of that curve. And we would call those like an outlier too, and a really terrible outlier. Then you're going to run some assumptions in that model, and you're going to say, you know what? We're going to speed through, we're going to get a vaccine tomorrow. Everything's going to be great. Everybody's going to come back. There's going to be no changes in enrollment. We're going to be fine. And then you're going to get an outlier to that positive side. But as you keep running your model, what's going to happen is you're going to start having a mean to that model start appearing. And then you can see those green lines of the data on that curve is what we would call standard deviation. And so you would say that within one standard deviation of the mean is really what we can say would be most likely to happen in this model. Within 2 standard deviations is what would be likely, and within 3 is like, yeah, that's like very, very outliers to the model. So when you as leadership, when you as a board member are really looking at how do you plan for the worst and understand what the possibilities are, that's how you would do it, is you would run your model a whole bunch of times and really understand what is most likely to happen, as opposed to what is, you know, not as likely, but still possible, and then what's really not within the realm of possibilities. So that's really maxim 1 for data modeling, is run that model as many times with as many permutations, and we'll see as we jump into our model how you can flex and play with the model and see what would happen in different scenarios, so that you're building that curve of possibility of what are the possible outcomes. And then the second one is, as anybody knows, this is a moving target that we're in right now. When Ari and I first created this model, the CARES Act had not passed yet. So we are like, okay, now how does the CARES Act really feed into this model? You know, I'm on a board right now of a school that's ECE through 6th. And, you know, the question that we're asking, that I added to the model that I'm building for them, is what happens if we discount tuition for ECE for virtual days for next year? So all of these new questions are coming up as the situation and circumstances are changing. And so a model can't be static. You always have to be thinking, what is the new data? What are the new sets of circumstances that you can add to it to refine the precision over time? All right, Ari, go ahead.
Thank you, Kelsey. And Barbara was just asking me to remind everyone, if you will please go in and update your name in the participant box. If you can include your name and the name of your school, that's helpful for the other participants to know who is there. And Kelsey, sorry about our slides going back and forth. It's being a little more sensitive this morning as I'm going to the chat box. I'm going to let others man the chat box so we don't keep flipping around slides here. We wanted to talk about a real world case of using this kind of modeling, both in the moment and historically. So many of you are so much more familiar with seeing slides like these than we ever were even 2 months ago. And this is data from New Jersey from late last week. I didn't have the heart to put up New York data from today. I think we all know what those curves look like. But we can see the way that you can use these very sophisticated models to get a sense of what I think of as the universe of possibility, right? The outcome of total deaths in New Jersey with good social distancing and flattening of the curve so we don't overwhelm hospitals, and without it, for example. I want to give you a sense of the way that this though manifests in a real life school community. So at the beginning of the Great Recession and the 2008 downturn, I was director of enrollment management at George School, a Quaker boarding and day school in Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia. And I was running the admission office with Christian Donovan, who some of you I think know, who's now the Director of Enrollment Management at Head Royce out in Oakland now. And Nancy Starmer, who was head of school and the board, wanted to be able to take what I think was an incredibly, I think, courageous and appropriate mission-driven decision. They wanted to be able to say that they were going to meet the increased financial need of any family currently enrolled at the school that had a life-changing circumstance. So family loses a job, something happens, and if you were in the school, they were going to find a way to keep you in the school. But they went to Christian and me and they said, can we afford this? In the middle of a board meeting impromptu, and we said, we don't know, but give us a little bit of time and we'll figure it out. And so what we did was use this exact same modeling approach. And if you think of it, we built a two-dimensional axis, right? So along one axis was the average increase in financial aid of a grant, right? How much would the typical existing financial aid grant go up? And we built a curve of what we thought that might look like, a possibility. And on the other dimension, we had a percentage of the student body who would have a life-changing circumstance, whose award would need to go from either a smaller financial aid package to a very large one, or a full pay family that would need to get a very large financial aid package. And the corollary might be a family that owns a series of restaurants right now, right, in the current crisis, might be in that same sort of situation. And what we did was we didn't run that model 100 times or 1,000 times. We actually ran that model 10,000 times, and we got, just as Kelsey said, a distribution, right? So I'm going to go back to the same distribution that you see here. And what we saw at the 2 standard deviation level, so with 95% certainty, was that that was a range that the board felt comfortable that they could afford. Now, it ended up falling, as one would expect, in the 1 standard deviation range. But the school was prepared financially, and that allowed them to make that decision very early in the crisis, which calmed families, I think very much helped create that upward spiral that I was talking about before. So as we turn our attention to the model itself, just to review for a moment, this is a multi-stage crisis. I think we're all too aware of that, right? The way in which these pieces are compounding upon one another. We urge you to just take a moment to think honestly into yourself where your school falls on this spectrum of needing to focus on viability, stability, or sustainability. And we know that that's a hard question to lean into, but it's a really critical one. I love the addition that Kelsey added to this lens of mission-driven, community-centered, data-informed decision-making. And we come from a particular lens. We really believe that iterative data modeling, as the picture becomes more clear, helps leaders make the best decisions in support and in stewardship of their school communities, right? And with that, I'm going to encourage us to just take a moment as we turn toward our model, which we'll talk about in a minute, and just take a deep breath, because some of the information that we're going to share with you is challenging, and we know that. So let's just take a moment. Okay. What we're going to talk about is a sample school, and we're going to start with a very healthy school and kind of work our way from there. And our school, which we have named Corona School, Causing Havoc Since December 2019, is a 300-student K-12 school. You can see the tuition, 25% of students on financial aid, the average grant. We map those against the national DASL data from NAIS, and we're assuming a 5% endowment. And you will see, we will change some of those starting positions, because I know that particular situation is certainly not representative of any individual school in this group, right? We'll show you a number of key performance indicators, KPIs. One of them, which we'll focus on mostly for next fiscal year, is visualizing the liquidity position of the school. Again, this is a very healthy school that we're starting with. You can see that it's nowhere near running out of cash. And here we're talking about cash, liquid and near liquid assets, right? Below that, we have an available line of credit. And so up to this line, that would involve certainly things like cash on hand, access to liquidity in accounts. We don't see, as happened in 2008, some of you remember when the Common Fund was frozen. We think that the Federal Reserve has taken steps that is less likely than it was to be an issue. Again, it's certainly possible. Schools may have some reserves to draw upon. That would all fall into this area for the most part. Beyond that, there's a line of credit. Some schools use their line of credit every year. Some schools never use their line of credit. Some schools don't have a line of credit. Below that are illiquid assets, which schools certainly don't want to access and sell at a loss if they don't have to. And some of them have provisions that would make it difficult or impossible to access those funds. And beyond that is insolvency, obviously. So with that, we're going to turn our attention and we're going to talk about.
And Ari, we had a quick question that came into me privately before we turn to the model is where we're getting our data from for the model. Do you want to address that? And I can also do that too.
So as you're going to see, we're going to change a number of assumptions in the model, and that's the whole point of the modeling approach that we're taking. So we hope that you'll kind of wait with us here and walk through this with us. We have based the assumptions in the model. Again, we wanted to start from the position of a school that was healthy going into the downturn. So we built a school based largely on DASL data and metricing a number of pieces off of national DASL data that was 5 or 6 years ago just scraping by, right, from a net operating position, and got step by step stronger over the last 4 or 5 years. So is entering this period in a pretty strong position. Again, we're gonna change those assumptions, and if you just bear with us, I think you'll see how that will happen. But that's a great question. So I'm gonna let Kelsey talk a little bit about her background while I switch over here to the other.
Perfect. Thank you. And I will also give the caveat beforehand. So what you're seeing is the model for this sample school. When we work with schools, it's really a custom job to fit a model to a particular school. So Ari and I are working with schools to bring this model to you, but if you would like to solo build on your own, we have created a tip sheet, not only from more of a 30,000-foot view of financial stability tip sheet, but also the nitty-gritty, how do you build a model like this on your own? So if you're looking to build on your own, look for that tip sheet. If you want some help from Ari and I or others out here who do this work, please let us know. So Ari and I have been doing modeling. It's almost the shared passion for us for a while now. As Ari mentioned, his graduate thesis was all about modeling financial sustainability in schools post-2008. And then at NAS, I was part of the team that was working on the Composite Financial Index, a program within BOA, to really bring a higher education financial sustainability tool into K-12. And so when I was doing the data visualization for that project, I reached out to Ari and said, hey, help me build a school so that we can play around with these ratios. So we did that. And then also when Ari was a lecturer at the University of Penn Graduate School of Education, he taught a class on financial sustainability and organizational stewardship. And I got to be a guest lecturer in his class doing financial modeling. So this, the only bright spot in this entire dark time is being able to work with a friend on a shared passion of modeling. So I'm going to orient you really quickly to the model. And once again, I'm going to kind of frame the model one more time. At NAS, I was working in the Institute for New Heads of School and doing a lot of research on how to support new heads. And the number one piece of anxiety or area of anxiety for heads of school is always finance. So we built this model and designed the data visualization really to cater to heads of school, and particularly heads of school or board chairs who don't come from a finance background, because a lot of times when you present a really complicated spreadsheet to a head of school, you almost see that kind of the eyes glaze over and like, I don't even know where to look kind of feeling. And so we wanted to make this model really accessible to the non-financial types in your school, and so that everyone would have the data to make informed decisions. So what we're going to do is we're going to see on the left side of the model is going to be the decision points. So the inputs of a model, which are then going to be affecting the right side of the model, which is the KPIs, the key performance indicators. So for this FY19, FY20, the key performance indicators that we're looking at are going to be our revenue, expenses, and net surplus and deficit. And so we had said earlier, CFOs, give us a little wiggle room, because I know that somebody's asking, like, is this operating revenue or is this, those kinds of almost GAAP accounting terms. So just kind of allow us to be a little bit more imprecise in order to really drive the point home for those non-financial types.
I would remind people that the goal of this model, right, is to be useful for this discussion, not slightly different for a board conversation, slightly different for a CFO level conversation, right? So we're trying to do something that's broadly applicable at the moment.
Absolutely. All right. And then if you look at those KPIs, you're going to see that right off the bat, there is some discrepancy between what is actually happening and the budget. So we're down $17,000 from the budget, and we haven't even touched anything. So I'm sure you're asking what's going on here. So we have made a couple of assumptions when building this model. The first one is market position or market returns. So we had so we're right now in April, so that would be Q4 of FY19, FY20. So we've had 3 quarters of market returns so far. As we all know, when we look at our market, at our investment returns, we had 2 fantastic quarters, Q1 and Q2, and then 1 incredibly devastating one. And so we are reflecting right there 3 quarters, 2 good and 1 bad of the market and our revenue, and so a little bit of a depressed revenue. And then with the expenses, we're saying that most probably some schools have had increased cleaning services, whether they had a potential outbreak on campus, or they're just really being vigilant to make sure that before they had closed their schools or had moved their schools online, that their students and their communities were healthy and their facilities were sanitized.
And
so that's why
Kelsey,
you're
we had
seeing
a question sent to me saying, wouldn't the downturn have only impacted Q4? And the answer is it depends on your school. Remember that different schools select different dates for calculating those investments. To show this, we chose a particular date that would have a slight impact on Q3 and then a much larger impact on Q4. It would be different as you were building your own model for your individual school or as we were helping you with that.
Exactly. And that just goes back to a model is really, there's no off-the-shelf model. You really have to customize it to the individual methodologies and accounting preferences of the finance team at your school. All right, so now we're going to go to the chat because we really want you to be involved in how we flex and play with this model. So one of the questions that we've heard from a lot of our friends who are still in schools is the decision is, should we offer emergency financial aid for this year, for FY19, FY20, for those families who have had a dramatic change in financial position and who are really, 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 really hurting. So I would like you to go into the chat really quickly and give us, what you want us to put in the model. We have parameters from no money all the way up to $75,000, and we can see how that plays around with what we're doing. So if you're thinking about this question of, do we make emergency financial aid available to our students now, then how much money?
I should, as people are typing in, I'll just say, remember, this is only for fiscal year 1920. Some of your schools are at different points in your tuition payment cycle. Also, we have chosen to model financial aid in a net tuition revenue approach. So it is we are looking at it as a reduction of revenue, not an increase in expense. We, again, could have a long accounting conversation that we are not going to have about that choice. But I think those of you more familiar will recognize that it's a wash at the end of the day when you look at the impact on total operations.
Mm-hmm. And so while Ari is going to move around the model, I want everyone to keep their eye on that graph on the side. So, and then the 3 numbers as they start moving around. I am very fortunate to be on a board with a former colleague of SSS who has now created a financial aid consultancy, Alyssa Evans, and who has just been a wealth of knowledge. And she has some incredibly sound advice that she has given our board, so I'm going to pass it along to you, is that after the 2008 financial crisis, there were a lot of families that had differing financial circumstances and so moved on to financial aid, who would probably never be in that pool beforehand. So once they got over the emotional hurdle, the emotional shock of being on financial aid when they never thought that that was going to be their circumstance, she said that they almost got comfortable in that position. And when their financial position improved to how it was pre-2008 with the recovery, they couldn't make that emotional leap of getting off of financial aid because they had been accustomed to that help from the school. And so she saw a lot of schools being in really difficult positions because they were having a hard time getting those families whose position had improved off of financial aid. So she has given us the recommendation to call it specifically emergency financial aid, temporary financial aid, and make it super clear to all of those families that this is really temporal in nature and that it's not a long-term commitment on the part of the school. So I'm passing that along for you.
So I decided, just sort of taking a rough average of the group, that we're going to make $30,000 available for this year. And some people say, well, tuition payments are done. Some schools are choosing to make that emergency aid available to help offset families who were already struggling and may have been behind in payments. Different schools, again, will take this on in different ways. Some schools will simply write that off. There's a number of ways that schools could approach this. Okay, mm-hmm. Let's turn our attention to fundraising.
Perfect. All right, so we know that a lot of schools have spring galas that are either being canceled or moved online. So much in the same way, how are you looking at your Q4 fundraising and what effect you are anticipating the COVID crisis will have on Q4 fundraising? Let's go to the chat. What do you think? What percentage drop do you think that you're going to see? 75%. Whew, yikes. You want to model out 75%, 50%, sure. 5. Let's just model out. And once again, keep your eye on those right KPIs as it starts moving around and we can see the differing drop. So remember, we're only really moving one quarter this fiscal year, and then next year we'll start playing around with the entire year.
So again, in some cases, we're trying to get a sense of the universe of possibilities. That's a phrase that I keep using. If it went down only 10%, we see about and again, I use only in air quotes, that's about a $16,000 loss versus 75%, which is a $120,000 loss. And as you look at these over a number of dimensions, you get a sense of the range of different outcomes, even though we don't know in particular which individual one may hit. So given the large range, let's assume that it goes down 25%, right? We're now down about almost $100,000 just from those two changes versus 40%. Now we're at 122. Kelsey, which would you like?
40% is great. Let's do that.
I know you would like 0% or an increase, but given the likelihood, we'll do 40%. Now endowment draw.
All right, so a quick note on how we're calculating endowment draw. First of all, we're taking a 4% draw. Ari and I had a really interesting conversation. I don't know if you want to talk about that, because yeah. I was talking to Damien Kavanaugh of MISBO yesterday, and he was saying that he anticipates a lot of schools are going to up their draw. When I asked Ari about that, should we model that, he said,
well, just to be clear, we're using a 12-quarter draw. We're making a simplifying assumption that our endowment draw and our investment income are moving at the same rate. We know that that's not exactly accurate for a lot of schools. But I certainly understand the point of looking at a change in the policy and an increased draw. Similar to Kelsey's point about emergency financial aid, I have advised schools to think about, if they need to, emergency lump sum endowment withdrawals, right? Rather than changing the percentage in the spending formula, to retain that discipline, right? But to think about designating an amount of money that must be pulled out, right? Rather than worrying about this 12-quarter smoothing and the implications. One is not right or wrong. It's just a difference of philosophy. I think for schools that, for example, have reserves, some schools are very hesitant to use their reserves. And my point is, these are the moment the reserves are made for, right? When you are in emergency. I do want to point out that, just very quickly, whether it's a 10% or a 75% loss, you can see the change here is much smaller because of that 12-quarter smoothing. And as those quarters compound, you'll see that grow and grow. So let's assume, just given the market at the moment, let's assume that your endowment, which isn't fully invested in the market, it's diversified, is down, I'll move it to 25%, right, in Q4. That creates a reasonably modest loss. Mm-hmm. We're going to turn our attention now to the expense side and talk about workers and other expenses. Kelsey?
All right, so we put this question through the mission-driven, community-centered, data-informed lens. So let's see what impact it would have on On our finances, all right, let's go ahead and furlough the workers. So spring athletic coaches and after school workers. And if you notice in my notes, I said that there's $25,000 worth of stipends for those workers. So you can see that really the difference is not that much. And so one of the things that we wanted to prove in this modeling exercise is really understanding where are those big levers and then the small levers. So if your big levers are the ones that you really, really need to focus on. The school that I'm working with to have an emergency board meeting today, one of their big levers is rent. And so they're talking about like, at what point should we start negotiating rent? So really having an understanding of like, where are the tension points within your financial model is going to be key. So in this case, furloughing workers really is not that big of a one.
And there's also a compounding of factors, right? So if you're a school who, for example, has a sports fee and is choosing to not refund your spring sports fee, right? But are choosing to furlough coaches, right? I think you should expect that there will be challenging feelings in the community about that. You may have challenging feelings anyway in the community about choosing to furlough workers. And there may be implications related to the CARES Act of doing that, right? I think we need to think broadly as school leaders about how all of those second and third and fourth order implications impact those decisions. And I think for many schools, they are beginning to realize that unless you're in that true viability conundrum, right, of trying to just survive the day, this is not a lever that many schools are wanting to pull. Again, every school is going to have to make their own decision in doing that. For the purpose of today, we're going to not check that box.
Perfect. So then we're going to move to auxiliary streams of revenue or auxiliary forms of revenue. So a lot of schools are offering after school care, summer camps, and then the question of spring trips and fees, whether or not they should be refunded. So Ari, let's go ahead and say we are going to refund after school care for Q4. And then we have the question of summer camp. So I know that a lot of schools have summer camp.
Right,
so I would like,
before you run to summer camp,
Sure.
which is important, I just want to show people because I'm getting a couple questions about what we're looking at.
Yeah.
You can see, for example, for after school care and spring trip fees, that there is both very slight savings in expense because they're not running and reduction in revenue. Again, model these specifically for your individual schools' situations.
Absolutely. And then to the question of summer camp. So I want to hear from all of you in the chat. Where are you right now in your thinking about if your school offers a summer camp? Are you running it? Are you canceling it? Are you delaying the start? Where is your current thinking on summer camps if you were offering summer camp right now? And while you put some information in the chat, I'm just going to give a little reference in that our scenario, our summer camp is spread over 2 fiscal years because we're starting in June and going to August. And so whenever we make decisions in this year, let's say we're canceling it, it's going to affect 1 month of fiscal year 1920 and then 2 months of fiscal year 20 and 21. So keep that in mind as we see the differences.
So you can see that as we move from run to delay, right? We saw some change. If we move from delay to cancel, there is no impact on this year, other than potentially one might argue there was a little bit of pre-purchasing savings, but they were not meaningful enough for us to model. So there's not a meaningful impact between delaying and canceling for the purpose of just fiscal year 1920.
And I'm looking at the chat, and there's a lot of them that say TBD, which goes back to Ari's point about the timing of your decisions. Of things are changing so quickly, and we're in a more precise picture of what we can look forward to or not look forward to in the summer is emerging every single day. So that's probably a smart decision of being a TBD school right now, or obviously communicating openly and honestly with your family. Although we are seeing a lot of canceling programs as well.
Kelsey, where would you like me to leave this one?
Yeah, let's cancel it for right now. I'm feeling pessimistic today.
I think we all know that at the end of the day, that decision about canceling may or may not be ours as schools to make, or yours as schools to make. That may be a decision made outside of that. So as we turn and switch our attention to 2021, let's just take a quick look at where we are. I think we've taken a reasonably conservative but not overly pessimistic view of the world over the next over the next month and a half or so, right? Because that's about what we have left, 2 months, depending on your fiscal year of 2019, 2020. We're down just from the point, and again, remember, you were all at a different point as of March 31st, which is when this model is built off of. We're down about $170,000 in revenue. We're up a little bit in expense. That leads us to be down $170,000 in net surplus or deficit. But for our very healthy school, and again, we're going to change the situation, we're still running a net surplus for this year, right? Just for this year. We're going to see how that changes in the future. Kelsey, should we just pause for a moment there and see if anybody has any clarifying questions just for this fiscal year?
Sure, absolutely. Feel free to ask questions. What I would also like to know is, any of you who are modeling currently in your school, are there any other decision points for FY19, FY20 that you're currently looking at that we didn't include in our model?
And as people are typing those in, we just want to point out, we chose these to be representative of different groups of decision making, right? We're certainly not suggesting that spring coaches are more or less important than bus drivers or other workers or this or that decision that school may need to have, that this particular refund is more or less important. We tried to have a range of the different types of decisions that you should be thinking through should you want to be taking this modeling on your own.
All right, I think let's go ahead and move to FY20, FY21.
So we'll just say that all of that carried forward. All of those conditions that we're staying with carried forward, and Kelsey's going to walk us through the KPIs for this new year.
Perfect. Okay, will you scroll up to the top, because I just want to orient everyone to the model one more time. So what we're seeing is that same format. We're going to have our inputs, our decision points on the left side of the screen that then impact the right side, the key performance indicators. So we're going to scroll down the right side to orient you to which key performance indicators we're looking at for 2020, 2021. You're going to notice there's a lot more of them. So first of all, we're going to see the kind of grouping of the net tuition revenue KPIs. So you're going to see enrollment, tuition, financial aid, and then finally the net tuition revenue. So we're going to see, as we play around with different enrollment scenarios, different financial aid scenarios, how those numbers will change, and that will cascade then into our next set of KPIs, which are that familiar graph we saw in 1920, which is visualizing the surplus and deficit. So we have that revenue, we have the expense, and then we have the surplus and deficit number that is then ported over into that graph. So you're going to keep your eye on that little yellow bar, which is the surplus or deficit bar on the right side, and see what happens to it as we start making some decisions.
And Kelsey, people will note that these are obviously different numbers. I said that we're carrying over. This is a new fiscal year, right? So can you just help us understand why these numbers are starting the year in the position that they are versus the board approved budget, which we were assuming going into this?
Absolutely. So right now we have to assume that we've had 2 negative quarters of market returns. And so that has affected our market position, our endowment draw, as well as our investment income. We've also made some decisions that are affecting us this year. So for example, we have canceled our summer camp. So we're seeing that referenced as well in revenue. And then expenses, Aria, I am actually drawing a blank. I think that's also increased.
So we decided that
cleaning,
many
right?
schools are thinking about sort of a very deep COVID-19 clean before they come. And we sort of asked around and asked what we thought the cost of that increased cleaning during 2020, 2021, early in the year might be. Not just at the very beginning, but knowing that as students come back, you're going to need increased custodial services.
Fantastic. So, and then we're going to see this liquidity position right now as our final set of KPIs. And you're going to see, I just repeated the revenue, expense, and net surplus and deficit numbers so that as we scroll down the page, we can see those still. And then we've added some differing positions. So we said we wanted to model out, we're starting out with a fairly healthy school. Well, what would happen if we had a remarkably different school going into this crisis? So for example, Ari just changed our starting liquidity position. So we're saying our liquidity position is March 30th, right? March 31st, or is it March 1 that we're doing?
March 31st was when
March
we
31st.
haven't skewed off of right now.
And so you can see as Ari plays around, you can see that the relative health of the school. So just give us a dramatically lower starting liquidity position, and let's see how everything's starts changing.
And context for that is I'm changing this. Many schools will have their lowest liquidity positions. Not every school's curve is different. In April, before the new tuition payments come in and deposits come in November, before the semi-annual tuition payments come in, and then again the following year. And so you can see that for the schools that are very cash lean at the moment, it's a very different position. It shifts the whole graph down. And again, it looks a little bit different because the scale changes. Also, some schools, let's assume that your school was on 30% financial aid, right? Then you're already down into this position. Or if you have a $1 million endowment, or for some schools who have no endowment. So some schools have no endowment, but significant reserves, less line of credit, more line of credit, right? So there's an ability to look at this. We know that for schools who are struggling with viability, this curve looks very different, right? Often for two reasons, which I'll mention very quickly. One, schools that have immediate viability concerns, schools that entered the pandemic on thinner ice, often tend to have families who are less likely to pay their tuition in one full payment up front, right? And we can expect that some of the families who are doing that may choose to spread it out over a longer period now. So they're going to be increasingly struggling with unlike their traditional curve, a lot of lump sum payments will be spread out over a longer period. And in addition, those schools tend to have a later admission cycle and more delayed deposits. So their deposits, rather than coming in all on time, where Kelsey is in the Bay Area, new students have about a week to make a decision on schools. Everybody signs their contract on time. Everybody deposits on time. I think many schools who are on our webinar right now are struggling to get deposits and tuition payments right up until the last day of school. And that obviously changes your liquidity and cash flow curves. So I'm going to set this back for the moment, and we'll keep coming back to this. But the position that we were working from before, 25% financial aid, $5 million endowment, $200,000 starting liquidity position, and a $200,000 line of credit. And because we've often worked from this position, let's look at a school that's entering, again, healthy with $500,000 at the beginning of April, right?
Perfect. Great, thank you. So let's go up to the top of our page. And once again, we're going to be working on the left side and changing the inputs. So I know that a lot of schools are really concerned and really focused on how the COVID crisis is going to affect enrollment and re-enrollment. And so let's play around with this. And once again, we're going to go to the chat to see where you think we're going to see the most change. So first of all, just to note that our tuition is starting off at $31,586. So coming from the Bay Area, this tuition is low for me. I'm sure it's low for a lot of people in the New York area, but this is basically pulled straight off of Dazzle data as a median tuition number for independent schools. So that's where we're getting that data from. And so I'm going to ask the chat really quickly, is we have a K-12 school that we're looking at, that we're modeling, and where do you think we're going to see the most change? Is it going to be new enrollment? Is it going to be re-enrollment? Is it going to be in the lower school, the middle school, or upper school? So tell me what your thoughts are in that chat. Greater changes in new enrollment, in re-enrollment, and then in which division do you think that we're going to see those changes? Lower school re-enrollments, pre-K through K enrollments, lower school, new lower school, and that's exactly what I thought too. But Ari then threw me a curveball and gave me another thing to think about that I think we're going to model really quickly as well. So Ari, why don't you just go ahead and do what the chat says, is give the lower school a more dramatic drop in enrollment. And then again, everyone, keep your eye on those graphs on your right and those numbers on your right. As we start changing things, you're going to see the net tuition revenue start dropping, as well as all of those other KPIs.
I'll just point out that if we, the way that we modeled this, new and returning are transferable. So whether it's 4 and 3 or 3 and 4, we end up with the same position. These, until we get to financial aid, are all assumed at the moment to be full pay students. So we'll assume that we are down in lower school enrollment in that way, that we lose 2 middle school students, and that let's say that 1 doesn't come, and that we have 1 student not come, we'll make this 2, just so there's a little bit of differentiation in the upper school, and that all but 1 of our students comes back. So we are down 13 students, all full pay, so that's about $410,000. That's obviously a lot of money, but it's about 5%. I think many schools could imagine, as difficult as that would be, navigating that difficult moment. We can see what the impact is here. Even for our very healthy school, that gets us just about down to our line of credit. But let's say that you're a school with international students, and we find out in August that either those students are going to have trouble entering the country, or that they're not able to leave the country that they're in, right? Or that there's a second wave of pandemic surge in the particular country that they're in, and that's going to delay or make it impossible for them to arrive. And we go from losing 1 upper school student to 9. Now we're in a position that's very different, right? Your school may choose to say they signed a contract, right? They're responsible for the tuition. Some schools won't do that. That's an individual decision, but it's probably not just going to affect here. I think we can imagine that it might affect here as well. And now, with that one change of international students being able to come or not come to your school, and not just boarding schools, day schools that have homestays, we're down 24 students and almost $750,000. And we went from a significant surplus now to a significant deficit, and we're beginning to run into trouble from a liquidity position. So that's just to give you a sense of how you model the range of possibilities that could be an outcome. Your individual school may have a preschool, and that would be different. It may have a much higher hit in lower school, that might be different, right? And some schools may see an increase. If families are frustrated with how the school that they're at is handling remote learning, you may see an increase in certain areas and suits, right? You can model all those possibilities. So right now, let's take the reasonably imaginable, I would say probably in the 1 standard deviation likelihood position of being down 15 students who are full pay, and about 5.8%.
Mm-hmm. And this model also assumes that we're not even considering any tuition discounting. Like I said before, one school that we're working on has an early childhood preschool model where you would discount tuition a particular percentage.
Kelsey, you're, I think, having some bandwidth problems. Do you want to call in and I'll talk about financial aid?
Sounds good.
Perfect. Kelsey right now would begin to start talking about financial aid barbell effects. Certainly many of us are aware that many schools have struggled for years with the barbell problem of having a number of full pay and a number of high need students, and not many people in between. And we certainly saw in the Great Recession around 2008 that a number of those full pay families began to filter into the the small financial aid package group. And so that barbell now is talked about a little differently, that there are in fact a number of very small financial aid packages and very large financial aid packages. I want to just say again, there are schools in this on our webinar today that have a completely different financial aid profile, and we understand that. We can and you can model that differently for your specific situation. But let's assume that we are starting here, that we have a reasonable distribution, a little bit weighted toward large financial aid packages. Your starting position, again, might be different. One of the things that we imagine is that some full pay families are going to need some emergency aid. And again, I want to go back to that conversation Kelsey said about emergency aid. So let's assume that 6 families needed that. But actually, those 6 aren't the full story, because some of these families will have fallen and need fallen down the size ladder, gone up the size ladder, I guess would be more appropriate, and need larger financial aid packages. So let's say that of that group that was receiving small financial aid packages, 2 came down here, 1 was here, right? And let's say that in addition, you had two families, one of whom had 2 students, so 3 total students, whose families owned a restaurant. That's it, and that's the one I keep using that has been closed, right? And they have basically no income coming in, and that you're going to need to give them a large financial aid grant to get through this year if they're going to remain in your school. But you have every reason to believe longer term that you both want to do that because of the mission of the school, and that they will be able to be a full pay family again in the future, right? So in this situation, we have 12 new families, either from new admission or changes in existing awards, right? And that includes a combination of changes to the previous amount and new families coming in, right? So there's 2 flows coming into that. We can see that the impact of that is here. It's about $163,000 for those 12 students. I think many, many schools are imagining numbers that are much higher than this, much, much higher than this. But that starting position, plus
Ari, can you hear me?
The international student issue. We can, Kelsey. already is putting
Perfect.
our very, very healthy school into our challenging position. And you can see that if that school, even with a reasonably small financial aid percentage, only had a $1 million endowment, you're now incredibly close to the bottom of your line of credit, right? 25% aid, $1 million line of credit. Many trustees and school leaders would be deeply uncomfortable entering the year being that close to running out of, potentially not being able to make payroll. And many schools are much closer to 30% aid or even higher, right? So just those two changes, not adding anything else into the mix, that's already part of the impact of the story that we see for certain schools. Other schools will struggle with that right here as well because of that delay in tuition payments that I spoke about before. Kelsey, are you back on? Can I turn it over to you?
I am. Thank you so much. It's always interesting to see right at 9 o'clock. I'm in San Francisco, so West Coast time, when everyone starts logging on for work, everyone's collective bandwidth starts dropping. I'm sure a lot of people in New York City with a high density population are experiencing a lot of the same interesting troubles of working from home.
Kelsey, we have one quick question on the chat. Susan is asking, how is the percent of students on aid changed by the change in aid award? As you can see, if we add if we change the students here, right? This changes this percentage, it changes this percentage. A school, for example, might choose to do an updated average aid award in each of these categories and here overall. It just depends what key performance indicators your particular school uses and has historically used, right? We're trying to choose a general approach that will be accessible to people here. So I'm going to go back to this.
And I can address Susan's question right there. So if you scroll up, Ari, really quickly to the financial aid. So the number, so do you see how we said budgeted number of students? The total number of students, 71, is correlating to the 25%. And so as you increase or decrease the number of students on financial aid, that budgeted number is different. And then we created a barbell effect going through the income brackets. So I hope that makes it clear if that's how we got those initial numbers, is the percentage of students on financial aid is tied to the total number.
And again, happy to
so what I want
anybody offline that might have additional kind of nuanced questions in that area.
Of how we built the model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some data into the chat as well, because we talked to Mark Mitchell, who's a former NAS colleague, and he is the VP of Financial Aid, and he gave us some statistics of looking at the impact of financial aid after, and Art, could you scroll up just a tiny bit as well? Impact of financial aid changes after the 2008 crisis. And so what I would recommend to you is that as you're building your model, go back into your own DASL data, and I'm sure NYSAIS could also pull some regional data for you as well. What were the changes in enrollment that happened in school and in your region after the 2008 financial crisis? What were the changes in financial aid? So these are numbers that are national. What are the regional numbers? What are the local numbers? What are your individual institutional numbers that, that happened after the 2008 financial crisis? We're not saying that it's going to be exactly the same, but again, it's good to have a reference point when you're building your model of what happened in the past and therefore what is more probable to happen in the future. So you can see that financial aid applications increased 16.7%. Students receiving aid increased 17.8%, and then financial aid spending per student increased 21%. So we could be looking at similar increases going forward.
So we have about 20 minutes left, and Kelsey's going to walk us through the remaining pieces of this model for about 8 or 10 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions as people want to ask them.
Mm-hmm.
So we turn our
so what we're going to do, so since we looked at fundraising a little at FY19, we're just going to breeze through both fundraising and endowment and investment so that we and then the auxiliary revenue stream so we can get to the expense side of things. So Ari, let's say we're going to be fairly conservative. Let's just say there's going to be only a 20% change in giving over the 2020-2021 fundraising cycle, and we're saying that because, let's say, families' financial positions have changed and there's a lot of acute need, let's say local food banks, et cetera, that people are giving to as opposed to the school. And so then our change in market returns, let's say for the first quarter of Q1, let's say a moderate increase, let's say we're going up 5% in the market. And then let's say, Q2, something happens, let's go down 15% in the market. Nope, 10% is totally fine. 15 is an option that we have. Then let's say another 20% drop in the market for Q3 because it's winter time. And then Q4, we're starting to get back on our feet. There's a vaccine, and let's say we're up 30%. So again, just a note is that we're using that 12-quarter smoothing average in order to calculate our endowment. Our endowment draw is 4%. So we can see that there's definitely a change in our endowment draw over the course of the year, but again, because it's that 12-quarter, it's not profoundly affected like other things would be. And then going on to our auxiliary revenue streams. So we made some decisions last year that are going to affect this fiscal year.
Asking me questions. Maxing out my cognitive load, I'm going to focus on Kelsey here just for a moment so I can keep these moving, and we'll get back to some of the questions at the end. Go ahead, Kelsey.
Perfect. All right, so since we chose to cancel our summer camp, we made that decision point last year. Ari, I'm going to ask that you drop the attendance of our summer camp by 100%. And we can see that the impact on our summer camp revenue in the graph below, as well as our overall revenue, has dropped significantly, and we are now almost $300,000 in a deficit. Note that once again, we're spread over 2 fiscal years for summer camp. So even though we've canceled summer camp for this fiscal year, we are still anticipating that we're going to have 1 month of June 2021 running, hopefully. And then we said that there's going to be perhaps 5% fewer students in after-school care. And we're getting that number by, we had a 5% drop in enrollment that we modeled out. And so even though it's not a perfect one-to-one comparison, we're saying that there could be a corresponding drop in students in aftercare if we have a corresponding drop in enrollment. And then as another auxiliary form of revenue, we have a lot of schools who rent out their facilities, either performance spaces, athletic fields, or just any other facilities rental. And so even though we're anticipating that students are coming back in the fall, a lot of school leadership might take the prudent decision to close down the campus to other visitors to protect the community. And so let's model out what it would look like if we closed the campus to facility rentals until January.
And now as we turn sorry, go ahead, Kelsey. As we turn As we turn our attention to staff salaries, just want to do a quick check-in here. One of the challenges as we look up here is that we're down 15 students in this model, right? But they're spread out over K-12. There's not a natural position among the faculty, for example, to take an FTE out if somebody was retiring, right? And we know that in the market in general, just as happened in 2008, we're going to see market-wide faculty and staff and administrators choose to stay longer, which is going to push the salary scale of all schools and in the aggregate up as people at the top of their earning potential don't cycle off and be replaced by other employees. And that's going to be a challenge. But also, this kind of spread out loss in revenue is very, very challenging. For the purpose of thinking about cost cuts, let's look at a school that's less healthy. Let's think about that school has 30% aid and $1 million endowment. Again, there are many schools in this chat today that are in positions that are significantly less healthy than that. And we'll even start with a liquidity position that's not horrible, but we'll start at $200,000. We can see that here is a school. In this case, this school probably would be a little bit lower here if we were to fully think about the timing of tuition payments. But this is a school that is deeply challenged for the remainder of the year, right? And that leads us to having to think about things on the expense side in a more draconian way.
Mm-hmm. Ari, would you like to go ahead and tackle the retirement contributions?
Sure. We know from data in 2008 that one of the first things that the schools did, as difficult as it is was to remove the retirement match, right? And we can see for a school that is a little bit healthier, I'll just go very quickly up to $500,000 here, right? That makes a meaningful difference in their position from being below their line of credit by $500,000 to being almost halfway closer to that. Nobody wants to do this. Is actually a more ideal time to be putting money into your retirement, but schools are talking about at this point about viability. So we'll work from this position here. Kelsey, you want to talk about salaries and reductions in force?
Absolutely. So I was in the classroom in 2008, and so I remember this acutely, that in the 2008 crisis, we had a wage freeze across all of our FTE categories. So Ari, let's model out what it would look like from dropping. So right now we have a planned salary increase at 3.5% annually. So let's go ahead and zero it out and say that there's going to be a wage freeze across all of our categories.
So we'll start with the head of school and the senior administrative team, which many schools did, many leadership teams did symbolically at the beginning. And then we'll include staff and teachers.
Mm-hmm. And so with the wage freeze, we have now almost gotten to the point where we are in the clear for the entire year with our line of credit. So, why don't we just do one more point of solidarity and give our senior admin and head of school a 0.5 wage deduction and see if we can get ourselves even better. All right, we're working. Yes. And like Ari said, we have that reductions in force modeling capability, but we're just going to hold off on it right now. We're really just from a mission-driven, community-centered field, we want to hold off on reductions in force as much as possible.
I will say some schools are choosing as much as possible not to do this because of potential CARES Act funding. Many schools certainly consult your attorney, your regional associations for advice and counsel on this. Many schools are applying for CARES funding, knowing that they can choose whether to elect to receive it after they have secured the opportunity for funding. Some schools are doing it because they absolutely must. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And another request that we've gotten for custom models is reducing non-exempt workers. So the amount of hours those non-exempt workers are working next year. So that's another thing that you can consider in that salaries and benefits category. So then our last lever is just overall expense budgeting. And if we zero out, if we just say there's going to be a budget freeze across all of our budget categories, then let's see what happens to us there. Again, your school might be different. Really, you have to understand what the levers are in your school. Is there a rent that you can negotiate? But with creating budget freezes and salary freezes, we've dragged our school back up into within its line of credit at $200,000.
Now, I will say that many schools are entering this year, and obviously they would be deeply challenged by entering a year here, right, with knowing that was on the horizon. Just want to speak for 1 minute to CARES Act funding and the timing of it. We know that there's likely to be at least a 60-day delay in that funding coming in. It may be 90 or 120 days. We're already hearing in the media significant challenges as organizations are applying for that. For schools for whom your curve looks like this, but right here, and there are a number of them who have reached out to me and to Kelsey and to others, when you need to be thinking about when that funding might come in and what its implications are for you, because it will have significant impact in this time period. Just so that people can feel assured, some schools are going to first choose not to replace retirements. So let's just say that we have one here and one here, and now just to make me feel a little bit better, we're a little further away from the edge as we step away from that.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have about 9 minutes, so let's switch back. We don't want to end things on doom and gloom. We want to give you some ways forward. So remember, we're really looking at modeling through that three lens framework: the mission-driven, community-centered, and data-informed way of making decisions in your school, especially in this time period where conditions are changing and there's a lot of risk and uncertainty in your decisions. And so the question that we get all the time is, what can and should schools be doing right now? What I would do is I would look at your capacity to model out the data that you have, the financial data that you have. A lot of you have incredibly deep staff in your in your business office. And so Ari and I have created a tip sheet for all of you who are looking to create a model like this on your own of what you should be thinking about. What are some tips and tricks in order to create something like this? I'm going to let you know that it took Ari and I quite a bit of time to build this model. So I would say if you're a sophisticated data user and data modeler and a data visualization specialist, you can expect about 35 to 40 hours worth of building the model and making sure that everything is working correctly. And then I would say if you don't have that skill set on your team, then it's probably double or triple while people get up to speed. So there's also the possibility of engaging Ari and I or other people who are doing this type of modeling work. But it's really important that you have those three lens frameworks. So if you're interested in talking to us, feel free to contact me. I'm going to be the point person. You can see my email address right there. And so we have about 8 minutes.
We have some questions.
And we're going to turn to questions.
Yep, we have some questions coming in. People can certainly unmute as well as ask the questions. I'll answer the one that came in from Brooklyn Friends School. It says, you said earlier that you ran through thousands of these scenarios to get the most likely scenario. How can we reasonably do the same? So I would say a couple of things about that. In that particular case, I was talking about the George School situation of modeling potential impact of financial aid. And there are some Excel techniques for doing that kind of work. I actually did, to do it in a little bit more enhanced way, I actually did that in MATLAB, which is a different software. Kelsey has made the point in every webinar, so I'll give her credit for this. We intentionally built this software, and Kelsey did this amazing visualization that you've seen in Google Sheets to prove the point that you can do this, right? We would love to work.
You can do it
with some schools, but the goal is to help the independent school community, right? And so we want you to know that you can do this work if you have the expertise and time to do it. And so specifically for running those many scenarios, that requires a little bit more modeling sophistication. But one way to get at it is to go back to Kelsey's point about the normal distribution curve, is you don't have to run thousands of them. Run a number of different scenarios just by hand and look at what the possible range of outcomes are. Or we can certainly talk online about what some of the techniques are for doing. There's no difference between doing 100 and 10,000 modeling runs. I do 10,000 just because it's well into the number that we know is large enough to be a representative sample. So that's kind of that number that stands out in the modeling community of scenario analysis.
So then the question is, do you know if the CARES Act program applies to standalone ECE pre-K programs? Ari, I'm going to let you, I know you've done some research on the CARES Act with.
So I am not going to speak to the CARES Act. If anybody from NYSAIS would like to, again, understanding of the CARES Act. I was actually just talking to my corporate accountant this morning. Understanding of the CARES Act changes day by day, I feel like. And I was actually talking to someone at the Department of Ed about a different piece of the federal funding, which is still being written as we speak. The Department of Education has 30 days to write that guidance for states, and that hasn't even been finished yet, to give you a sense of, now that's outside of this particular CARES Act funding that many independent schools are looking at. I do want to just mention the other piece. There were several questions about the curve. So when you think about a probability curve, that can play in different ways, right? It can be a modeling input where you can say in this 10,000 scenario run, we're going to look at the universe of possibilities, and we think those possibilities fall into this kind of pattern. And it can also be an output when you think about where that falls in a spectrum, right? And so more specifically, what I mean is you want to know what is likely enough to happen to worry about, right? We can't worry about the things that are beyond the scope of possibility, because frankly, there's too many things as heads of schools and CFOs directly in front of you that you must worry about. And so in a much more sophisticated modeling approach, we define those inputs for a number of variables that we want to run through scenarios. And from an output point of view, for you to do this on your own at your school without any additional help, what I would say is walk through a bunch of scenarios, change those numbers, and see what range falls in the most amount of times. Remember that first standard deviation is 67%. Second standard deviation is about 95% of the scenarios, right? And so you can do some of that work by hand with us. And once you get up to about 30 different scenarios, that gives you a sense of roughly the range that you're speaking of, okay?
Mm-hmm.
We have a question about the slides and materials that'll be available after the webinar. Kelsey, you wanna take that one?
Absolutely. So we're giving you our slides, and we are also, like I said before, we created that tip sheet for the people who are interested in solo building a model on their own, to give you some guidance on tips and tricks in order to do that. And then I am deferring to NYSAIS whether or not you'll get the recording of the webinar, but I think you will, because they are recording it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
We will be sending a recording with that tip sheet within a few days, and some of you have been getting some of this delivered to your spam folder, so keep an eye on that as well. It doesn't always go directly where we want it to go.
Anybody who wishes to unmute and ask us a real live question, you're welcome to do that as well. Let's see what other questions are out there.
And I do see, Marcy, that you put in the chat that the CARES Act is going to be a future eSeminar. So
that's our hope. It's not planned yet. I can't provide you with a date yet.
I want to make one point to people who are going to go build this on their own, which we're glad for schools to be able to do, because we know that resources are tight. I encourage you to find a partner to do this work with. I've built a version of this model at least 3 different times in my life. And twice I did it completely on my own, and now twice I've done it with Kelsey, so I guess that's 4 total. One, it's a heck of a lot more interesting, and these are unhappy numbers, but more fun to do with somebody who you know and trust. Also, these are very complicated models that as heads and boards will ultimately be making decisions that impact people's lives and the future of communities. And it is really helpful to have a second set of eyes on assumptions and just to do data validation and checking. So if you are a school that's going to do it on your own, that is wonderful. I really encourage you to not, tuck yourself away and do this in isolation. That's a good way to have propagation Excel or Google Sheets errors.
Yeah, confirmation bias.
Yeah, and confirmation bias. So.